Hello and welcome. I am your host, Goblin, and tonight we are going to be talking once again about fairies, or more like different cultures' versions of fairies. Fairy is the word used in Irish and Celtic folklore for diminutive humanoid beings that seem to be tied in some way to nature, but every culture across the world has their own version of this type of entity, with their own corresponding name, but very striking similarities to one another in terms of behavior and legends. However, there are also some unique qualities and quirks that each culture's beings exhibit that are absolutely fascinating. So tonight, there's going to be a mixture of first-hand experiences and a lot of folklore. I will be reading partially from forums and surveys, such as Reddit, Your Ghost Stories, the Fairy Census, and then I'll also be citing different resources like books and articles regarding our various topics. We'll be looking at the fairy cultural equivalent in Malaysia, the United States, Mexico, the Philippines, and more. So if that sounds interesting to you, let's get started because I've got a lot planned. First, we are going to take a look at an account posted on the website Your Ghost Stories, a place where people share their paranormal experiences. This one was submitted by Bart43. It took place in Malaysia, and it's called Bathing Princess. I would like to tell a story that happened to my father when I was little. As my father told me, there used to be an abandoned well at the back of my late grandmother's house in the village. It has been abandoned since after the war in the early 70s. The condition of the well was totally deserted, but there was still water coming out from it. The brick and stones around it had all been taken down, and Grandpa had been trying to cover it by filling it with dirt and soil, but to no avail. It would still be filled up with water, so they decided to just let it be. My father used to take buckets of water from the abandoned well to wash his car every weekend morning. One day, on the foggiest morning ever, my father went as usual to the well. Just as he was nearing the well, he heard the sound of women talking and giggling. He stopped and froze, and to his surprise, he saw the shadows of women bathing in the well. One of the ladies started humming a song. My father got scared and ran back into the house. He did not tell anyone about it for a week. He even came down with a fever. After he told my grandma, she laughed and said that's what happens when someone doesn't listen to her. Apparently, she has been warning my father not to go to the well or anywhere near it. She says that it has been the place where the Puteri Bunyan, or elf princess, liked to bathe with her friends. It's always been like that. That's why Grandpa was trying to seal it away. After that, my father never set foot near that place again. Every time I bring the story up, my mom laughs at him. Now it was all just a memory, as that house was demolished after my grandparents died. I love this story. Simple as it is, it's very spooky and very magical at the same time. So, naturally, I started looking into the beings in this story, and I knew I'd be interested, but I was absolutely amazed with what I came upon and what I learned when I was doing my research. The author of this story's grandmother called these shadowy bathing women Puteri Bunyan, which means elf princess in Malay. Of course, I apologize up front for any butchering of the Malay language I end up doing with my American English phonetics. So, this princess would be a member of a supernatural race called Orang Bunyan, sometimes just referred to as Bunyan. Bunyan means elves, and Orang means people. And while putting Orang Bunyan into Google Translate, we'll translate it as goblins, which I do love. The phrase actually means something closer to hidden people. I've also seen it translated into forest people, but hidden people would make sense as they are generally invisible to humans unless they allow for themselves to be seen, or a person has a spiritual gift or a second sight that gives them the ability to perceive otherworldly beings. When they are seen, they're described as looking basically the same as humans, with little to no distinguishable difference, though they are rumored to be strikingly beautiful, particularly the women, and may lack a philtrum, which is the groove in the middle of your upper lip. So, right off the bat, I already noticed a similarity to Irish fairies in that they are described as looking just like humans. Not always, of course. They are shapeshifters and can take on other forms like a black dog, for example. But there's a quote I love from this interview with Eddie Lanahan, the great Irish storyteller and oral historian, who says he was talking to a man who claimed to have met the fairies, and Eddie asked him what they looked like. And he says the man took a long look into the fire and said,
"The person sitting beside you," he said, "could be one of them, and you wouldn't know it."
I just love that. It's so spooky. I'll include a link to that interview in the description if you want to watch it. It's really good. So, not only do the Orang Bunyan look just like humans, but they basically behave the same as well. In their own world, which is a spiritual world that is parallel to ours, that sometimes intersects, they have their own society structured very similar to ours, with families and hierarchies and royalty, hence the elven princesses in the story we read. They are also said to dress in traditional clothing of a bygone era, and these are all more details that are similar to Irish fairy lore. They do interact with humans from time to time, and sometimes these interactions are positive, helpful, even romantic, and other times they are deadly. I don't know if fairies or similar supernatural beings necessarily act with good or bad intentions, or if they are guided by the socially constructed moral compass that us humans have devised, but all the same, let's take a look at some of the different things that Bunyan are said to do, and we'll start with the bad. Fairies are known to abduct human children, and the Orang Bunyan are no different. Here's an excerpt from a 2011 article by Susan Tam titled, "Orang Bunyan Are Neighbors in the Supernatural World." Quote, "A mother-to-be was in labor. Her midwife was urging her to push hard, hoping the newborn would be delivered smoothly. But there was no baby. Only the mother's placenta appeared. No child was born. What happened? Where did the baby go?" Malay animism expert Associate Professor Datuk Zainal Abidin Borhan explained, "In a case like this, the baby was most probably taken by the Bunyan community. No medical or scientific reason can explain this incident, but if you believe in the supernatural world, you might speculate this. The midwife attending to the delivery could have had spiritual powers and might have struck a deal with the Orang Bunyan to offer the newborn in return for material gains or fulfillment of other requests." End quote. Orang Bunyan have also made headlines for potentially causing the disappearance of hikers in Malaysia. An article from The Star says, quote, "Lost hiker mystery. Did Orang Bunyan kidnap Teo Kim Lean?" and refers to the disappearance of a 53-year-old hiker in 2015, who sadly was never found. Unfortunately, I can't read the full article without paying a subscription, but I have another article published in the New Straits Times in 2019 about a man who went missing while participating in a marathon. It says, quote, "The 29-year-old Mohammed Ashraf Hassan was reported missing by his friend upon realizing that he did not reach the finish line. The search has led to multiple theories by the public, who claim the runner has been abducted by Orang Bunyan. They even allege that a boma, or shaman, was called in to perform rituals to find Ashraf. End quote. As far as I can tell, Muhammad has not been found either. Finally, an article from Malaysian media outlet called Juice has a post from 2020 titled, "Missing 10-year-old girl believed to have been kidnapped by Orang Bunyan." Recently, a village in Sabah was racked with fear when a 10-year-old girl went missing and was believed to have been kidnapped by not a human, but an Orang Bunyan. Authorities were called immediately to investigate the incident. The local chief officer interviewed several residents, and they all came to the conclusion that the girl was chosen by an Orang Bunyan. The chief said, "The incident happened close to Maghrib prayers, approximately 6:30 in the evening. The victim was found in an open area, lying down with her hands folded atop her chest. When she was discovered, she was in a very weak and vulnerable state. Her family members promptly performed a kanduri salamat, which is a ritual to pray for the safety and well-being of those in attendance. Although there is no clear explanation as to what happened to the girl, kidnappings performed by Orang Bunyan is not unheard of in Malaysia. The incident usually happens during Maghrib prayers, similar to the case in mention, believed to be the peak hour for spirits or mythical creatures to roam free in search of victims. Oftentimes, the victim will be found in an open field, caught up in a complete daze. Most victims don't recall their abduction. Places that are the most susceptible to these kind of abnormal kidnappings are usually areas that are uninhabitable, such as thick forests and rivers. Some victims even say that they would smell a pungent perfume or see a silhouette before blacking out. While the existence of these supernatural beings might be a point of contention among urban Malaysians, there are still many who have deep respect for local folklore." End quote. Thankfully, this child was found alive, and as far as we know, she's all right. Whatever happened to these people, of which there are many possibilities, it is interesting to note that there is modern cultural belief that Orang Bunyan could have had a hand in their disappearances. Besides just outright abducting people, Orang Bunyan also are believed to cause hikers and climbers to become disoriented in the jungles and mountains. Whether this is done with mischievous or malevolent intent, who's to say? On the other hand, one of the nice things that the Orang Bunyan are known to do, which I found completely fascinating, is to lend out sets of dishes to people for special meals. So this I learned about pretty much entirely through comments in Reddit threads. These are all from different posts regarding Orang Bunyan on the Malaysia subreddit. And all of these and all of my references are linked in my source list, which is accessible in the description of wherever you are listening. Lalat1881 writes, "Orang Bunyan does exist. The Malay call them by that name, while in Islam they are called jinns. My late grandfather used to tell stories about how village folks borrowed dishes from Orang Bunyan for weddings or festivities in the 1930s. To do so, you just go to a place, usually at the edge of a jungle or in the middle of a garden, shout Assalamu alaikum a few times, calling out the Bunyan's name, and the Bunyan will return the salam. Then you say what you want in a polite, neighborly manner. You say, 'Sorry to bother you, my family has a wish. We want to do a kanduri, which is a ceremonial feast for special events. 2 days from now, our son is getting married. We expect a big crowd, but we do not have enough dishes. So, can you please lend us some for the event? We would be so grateful.' The Bunyan will say, 'We will help. You go back safely, and we will send the plates to you later.' My late grandfather said the Bunyan will send out the plates at night. The plates will appear on the kitchen floor or on the front stairs of your house. He would wake up early before dawn and see them already there." I was also skeptical about this whole thing until later, as a grown man, I heard the same stories from other older Malay folks in other places. One thing I forgot to emphasize, you cannot just do this cold. I got the hints that they were neighborly and knew each other well already, and you would need to have some kind of knowledge or practice to do this. During those days, the village folks and the Bunyan were good neighbors. They respected each other's boundaries and lived quietly. Another commenter says that their spouse's grandmother claimed to have borrowed plates and cups for her own wedding. Quote, "I just thought it was a funny story she told to joke with me until you mentioned it. She told me during her time, the villagers had no manners. They didn't return the plates and also broke some of them. The Bunyan were angry, so a few babies went missing." End quote. This particular thread has so many comments about people hearing about the tradition of the Bunyan lending plates. I thought this was so fascinating. It seems like it's very specific to this culture, but I could be wrong. Let me know if you know something similar, but a commenter named Astalon agrees with me. Quote, "I am always intrigued by the stories of borrowing dishes that come from the Malay community. It is often told in a factual manner, with multiple people corroborating. What I find more interesting is that almost all the stories ended around World War II. I have yet to hear a story of something more recent. It does seem that this practice of orang bunyan, lending out their kenduri crockery, has died out. And I found a recurring explanation for this, which is that humans would either damage or misplace the dishes they were given, upsetting the generous elves and causing them to retract their services. This is referenced in a previous comment I read about the Bunyan being so angry about their mishandled plates that, quote, "a few babies went missing." That's the only example I've seen of such a malicious punishment enacted by the wrong Bunyan. Usually they just cease the practice of plate lending or withdraw from human interaction altogether. Mittens 519 says, "I lean towards needing solid proof, but my family members really believe in orang bunyan. My maternal grandma used to put money at this small hut. This was back in the 1990s. She would slip the money next to the water jug or under the coconut shell at the entrance of the hut. She did this before holding any kenduri at her home to ensure a smooth event. What's interesting is that seconds after Grandma placed the money, I could not find it. I flipped over the coconut shell and it was empty. There's also a story about old ceramic plates at Grandma's house that keep appearing back at home after being thrown away. I didn't witness this, but my mom, dad, and brothers did, as they were the ones getting rid of those plates. My grandma is still alive at 93 years old, but unfortunately she's senile now, so I could not ask her about this bunyan, nor to clarify why she has ceramic plates that know how to find their way home." Going back to a previous thread, Lalat 1881 says, "They are not like ghosts or monsters like you see in movies. They just exist on a different plane to us or in another dimension, living their life, doing their own thing, having a family, and so on. You do not bother them, and they do not bother you. Do not call them out for favors or trouble them with your petty problems. You respect them and watch your manners where they reside, the forest, the sea, on top of mountains and hills, and you will be fine." Absolutely fascinating. With that, I think we will move on to our next topic. So, I found a post on the Humanoid Encounters subreddit that has a story pasted there that was originally shared on the website indigenouspeople.net called The Gifts of the Little People. The story is about a little boy who lives with his uncle due to the death of his parents. His uncle mistreats him, giving the boy only rags to wear and leaving him to do all the hunting as he was too lazy and go out and do it himself. One day, while out hunting near the river, the boy comes to a place where the joga, or little people, are said to beat their drums. While many hunters are afraid to come to this spot, the little boy knows that he should be fine as long as he, quote, walks with good in his heart. The boy notices two little people having trouble shooting down a squirrel, so he shoots it for them and insists that they keep it because he has already bagged a couple. The little people are grateful and invite the boy to their lodge so they can thank him properly. The boy agrees and goes with them. Quote, "The two little people led the boy to the river. There, a tiny canoe was waiting, only as big as one of his shoes, but his friends told him to step inside. He took one step and found he had become as small as the tiny hunters and was sitting with them inside their canoe. The little people dipped their paddles, and up the canoe rose into the air. It flew above the hickory tree, straight to the cliffs and into a cave, the place where the Joga people lived. End quote. There, the little people taught the boy useful information about animals and plants that would assist him. Quote, lastly, they showed him a new dance to teach his people, a dance to be done in a darkened place, so the little people could come and dance with them unseen, a dance which would honor the Joga and thank them for their gifts. End quote. Finally, after 4 days with the little people, the boy says he must return home to his village. When he does, he finds that everything has changed, and he is greeted, though found to be a stranger. He looks down to find that his rags have been replaced by new, fine, embroidered buckskin, and that he was no longer a little boy, but a grown man. He asks about his uncle and finds that he has been dead for many years now. Quote, I see, he said, the little people have given me more gifts than I thought. And he began to tell his story. The wisest of the old men and women listened well to this young warrior. They learned many things by so listening. That night, all his people did the dark dance to thank the Joga for their gifts, and in the darkness of the lodge, they heard the voices of the little people joining in the song, glad to know that the human beings were grateful for their gifts. And so it is, even to this day, that the little people remain the friends of the people of the Longhouse, and the dark dance is done. So this is similar to many stories told in Celtic folklore of people entering or being taken to the land of the fairies, staying for what seems like only a night or two, and then returning home to find years have passed and everyone they know has died, which usually has kind of very tragic tone and implications to it, and frightening, right? However, in this case, it seems to have worked out for the better for the boy in the story. He's come back with lots of useful knowledge, he's established a friendship with the little people, and he's free of his nasty uncle. I found another version of this story in a book by Mason Winfield called Shadows of the Western Door, Haunted Sites and Ancient Mysteries of Upstate New York, with an added detail that the boy ate a tiny, thimble-sized bowl of corn soup that would magically replenish itself every time he drained it. But, once again, a key takeaway in this story is the teaching of the dark dance, which the author notes, saying, quote, in so many Iroquois supernatural tales, the human characters ask the beings they encounter, what sort of dance can I bring back? It would seem that one of the most significant features of any individual mystical experience was the ritual it might impart to the nation. Many tales seem to almost serve as explanations, origin myths in a way, for the cultural rites. And that definitely seems to be the case. This story of the little orphan boy who meets the little people and brings back this dance, I found different versions of it that were generally the same, just a little different, a little variations in each telling. And it does seem to serve as the origin story of how this dance came to be a part of the culture. So the dark dance is part of a ceremony that I've also seen referred to as the Pygmy Society, that is done at night in order to honor, appease, or hold good rapport with the little people. If the little people were heard drumming or throwing stones, it was believed that they were requesting a dark dance. I'll read an excerpt from a 1909 issue of the American Anthropologist Journal. This is pulled from an article by Arthur C. Parker called Secret Medicine Societies of the Seneca. The ritual of the Pygmy Society consisted of 102 songs. All the songs are sung in darkness. It is believed that the spirit members of the society come and join in the singing, and their voices are thought to be audible at times. The water drum and the horn rattle are used in this ceremony for keeping time. There's a brief dance. The dark ceremony is designed to appease certain spirits and to procure the good offices of others. Meetings are called at any time for the purpose of appeasing the spirits, and even by non-members who are troubled by certain signs and sounds, such as the drumming of the water fairies, or stone throwers, pygmies, who, by their signs, signify their desire for a ceremony. The pygmies are thought to be very powerful beings. They demand proper attention, or they will inflict punishment on those who neglect them." End quote. It is also believed that the little people had the ability to cause people to become ill. So, in addition to singing, dancing, and music, the ceremony would also include chanting and the offering of tobacco. All right, now I'm going to read a bit from Myths and Legends of the New York State Iroquois by Harriet Maxwell Converse. Quote, "The divisions of the Joga are the most beloved by the Indians. The office of those elves is to protect and advise the fruits and grains. They are the little people of the sunshine who bring joy and brightness to the Indian's heart. In the springtime, these little people hide in dark, sheltered places and whisper to the earth as they listen to the complaints of the growing seeds." The editor has questioned a number of Iroquois children regarding the Joga and has been told that these little folk have sometimes been seen running through the woods. They generally are dressed in all the traditional paraphernalia of the Indian, but sometimes are entirely naked. 2 Seneca children who described them said that they were about a foot high and ran very fast. With adults, they are more heard than seen and are known by their drumming on the wet drum. The listening initiate, who hears the tap of the ringing water tom-tom, knows instantly that the elves are calling a council and summons his society to meet and make the proper offerings to these elves, who run in the darkness and who wander upon the mountains. These elves are naturally unsuccessful hunters. This is not because they lack skill, but because the animals have learned to detect their peculiar scent. Because of this, the members of the Pygmy Society save the parings and scrapings from their fingernails and tie them in little bags to throw among the rocks for the elves. They are believed to saturate them in water and bathe in it. The animals then think that human hunters seek them and are not afraid." End quote. So the Joga are generally benevolent and helpful towards the indigenous peoples, only punishing them to either teach lessons such as wastefulness or mistreatment of plants and animals, or if their relationship is neglected and the ceremonies are not performed. Hyendanese relates a couple of experiences with little people among the Seneca peoples of New York in his book Seneca Indian Stories. He says that when his older sister was around the age of 5, she was sitting in the doorway of their house, and she saw 2 children come from the direction of the river and begin to walk down the lane towards her. She saw them stop beside an apple tree and call out to her to come play with them. She told her mother, who looked out and could not see the children herself, and instructed her young daughter to come inside. As soon as she did so, the children began to walk away from whence they came. Quote, Hyendanese said that his mother was alarmed about what his sister had seen and told the neighbors what had happened, and one of the old women said that what his sister had seen were Joga, and that they would have to have a ceremony for her, which they did. Nothing happened to his sister, and she never saw the little boy and girl again, but she never forgot about them and what happened. End quote. Next, he tells a story about one of his neighbors on the Allegheny Reservation. Quote, "This man was walking along the railroad tracks one night in early winter when he was waylaid by 2 men whom he recognized. They struck him on the head with a club and dragged his body to a swamp that bordered the railroad tracks and left him unconscious there. When the man regained consciousness, there were little people pulling him by the hands, saying, 'Get up.' When the man tried to arise from the ground, he found that he was unable to do so because his clothing was frozen to the ground. The little people noticed this and worked and pulled his coat and trousers until they were able to free him. In the meantime, he lapsed into a light sleep, and the little people again pulled his hands and arms and told him, 'Get up.' This time, he was able to regain his feet, but he didn't know which way to go, as he was in the swamp, and it was a very dark night, and he couldn't see well in the darkness. The little people said, 'This way,' and led him out of the swamp and onto the railroad tracks. Once back at the railroad tracks, he knew where he was, and he staggered, wounded and very cold, to his home, where he related to his family what happened to him, and said that if it hadn't been for the Joga, he would have frozen to death in the swamp. He believed in Joga and was grateful to them ever after during the remainder of his life. Even today, on a nearby reservation, ceremonies pertaining to Joga are conducted in conjunction with the dark dance, which is a highly secret function of the Medicine Society. So doubling back to the Reddit thread where I began this topic, there is a comment there that I'd like to read from Hey, I'm Chrissy. They say, "This story made me smile. In Algonquin, we call them Bagwajanini. So often stories of the little people are scary, but they're nice to people who are kind and respectful. An elder on my res told me a story of when she was a little girl. She saw two little people while playing in the woods near her home. They asked her to come play at their home, and she went with them. They had fun, they danced, they played, and it felt like 30 minutes at most had gone by. But when she got home, it was nighttime. She had been gone all day, for at least 6 hours, and her parents were worried sick for her. My cousin's great-uncle also has a story of a time he was hunting and got lost in the woods. Just as he was starting to panic, he saw a little person beckoning him in a certain direction, so he followed. It stayed up ahead of him and led him to an area of woods he recognized. When he looked back at the little person, it was gone." End quote. As we've seen illustrated in 2 stories now, the little people are known to lead lost travelers back to safety. I didn't find any examples of the little people being cruel or dangerous unless they were punishing someone who either disrespected them or nature. To cap this subject off, I'll read an excerpt from an article in a 1946 issue of the Journal of American Folklore by John Withoft and Wendell Hadlock. Quote, "An interesting explanation of the relationship of these spirits to the Iroquois people was offered by Descahe, a Cayuga chief at Six Nations Reserve. He suggested that the Indians had been in Americas so long and had such an intimate contact with their natural environment that they had formed relationships with beings and things of which Europeans had no knowledge. Since the whites have cleared the land, some of their relationships have changed. The spirit animals now need more attention, and the little people have withdrawn to the westward and are now rarely seen, although their presence is sometimes very real, and they have not severed connections with the native people." End quotes. There is so much to cover when it comes to little people. Every tribe across North America has their own legends and names for these beings. So it's definitely something that we will return to in the future. All right, next, I'm going to read a post on the cryptozoology subreddit called "A Post About Duendes, Gnomes, Elves, and Little People." Growing up with a Mexican grandmother in Southern California, I grew up listening to tales of El Diablo, phantasmas, most notably La Llorona, the spirit of a woman who lost her children and wandered nights looking for kids to claim as her own. My family would use this story as a way to make sure the kids wouldn't be out late at night. I also grew up hearing about duendes or gnomes, though not just from my abuela. My grandmother would tell stories of duendes playing tricks on people in the forest. She told a story that she once saw some as a child. Growing up, I would go to large family gatherings, the kind where everyone is an uncle, aunt, or cousin, even if they really weren't. At one of these family gatherings, I must have been around 15 years old at the time, there was a large group of younger cousins. The group consisted of about 6 or so female cousins, ranging from the ages of 5 to 12. You would always see them playing together, always smiling and happy. So at this particular family gathering, I noticed the oldest one off in a corner, watching the other girls play. She had a despondent look on her face, and I'd never seen her like that before. I asked her what was the matter, and she shook her head. I left her alone for a while, and later she approached me and said that she could tell me, but that I wouldn't believe her. I told her I'd try my best to believe her, and she told me that she didn't care if I did or not. She appeared almost scared to tell me. Her story goes that she saw duendes creep into her room that she shared with her younger sister. She said she saw 4 duendes come into her room from her open window, climb up her dresser, take something, and leave. I'm sure she gave other details, but it's been too long to remember. I'd love to ask her now as an adult, but it's been years since I've heard from her. At 15, my first impression was she was making all this up, but I found it strange that she would lie. I found the way she told the story strange. This girl seemed genuinely scared of the experience she had had. The next story I heard when I was around 18 years old was from my best friend's mom, who grew up in Bolivia, close to the jungle. She said that as a little girl, she was lured into the jungle by being put into a trance-like state by duendes. She remembers feeling that the duendes wanted to play with her, so she followed them towards the jungle and was only snapped out of the trance by her younger sister, who had grabbed her before she entered the thick of the jungle. This was an honest woman, well into her 50s, who said things as they were. The last story comes from my girlfriend, who I believe to be honest with a good head on her shoulders. About 10 years ago, she visited the Philippines, and while staying at an aunt's house, she noticed her younger cousin behaving oddly. She mentioned it to her aunt, who told her that her cousin plays with duendes. When she asked her cousin about the duendes, who was around 7 years old, she told her that she would play with them out near the bushes. She said the duendes would get mad if she refused to play with them, and that they would at times hold her back from returning to her house when her mother called, but they wanted to continue playing with her. They even hurt her at times. The aunt confirmed that she had seen them, and had been trying to figure out a way to shield her daughter from the duendes. My girlfriend's aunt told her recently that if she asked her daughter about it now, she wouldn't recall any of it, perhaps due to the trauma of these experiences. Who knows? Accounts of duendes, gnomes, or little people come from all over the world. I've just mentioned some from 4 different countries, 2 different continents. I don't believe them to be a work of literary fiction, but a creature we have yet to officially place. I hope this post brings others to share any of their experiences. And indeed, it does. There are quite a few comments about experiences, so let's go through some of those now. One comment reads, "Several years ago, I took care of a patient in labor. She had lived in California and casually mentioned seeing fairies in her garden there. Her mother was sitting at her bedside and backed up her story. They seemed shocked that I found the story shocking. This isn't firsthand, of course, but I will give you what I have. They said they would see them flying around their flowers and occasionally lighting on them. I quizzed them about it to see if maybe it wasn't hummingbird moths, but they were adamant they were about 5 inches tall and looked just like tiny little people with wings. I asked if they wore clothes, and they said yes. This was about 3 years ago, and I wish I'd followed up by having them give me sketches or something, but at the time, I didn't want to appear to be the super weird nurse. My family is of Irish and Cherokee descent, and I heard about the little people often growing up. I remember my mother said my grandmother told her that places in the forest covered with a carpet of moss were where the fairies gathered to dance. I also remember hearing about them stealing milk straight from the cow when a cow would mysteriously dry up. I always assumed they were stories to entertain kids, but who really knows?" A comment from Goodbye Candy says, "My dad's side of the family have duendes following them as well. My grandpa is from Tula de Allende, Mexico. Last time I went to visit, he told me about a river that he never goes to anymore because he said he saw a bunch of duendes having a gathering there. He didn't go too into what was going on, but it freaked him out a lot, and he now stays away from the river. He mentions a lot about his loose change going missing, and he also told me about how he's sometimes eating caldo or frijoles, and he'll have a tortilla on his right side, and he'll look down and it's gone. Then it reappears when he looks away. I do believe him. I don't think he would have a reason to lie. I've also gone to a tarot reader a couple of times, and she always brings up how I have duendes or sprites following me, and to always carry dry roses in my purse to please them, and have green stuff and natural flowers around the house for them. She also mentioned to keep salt in my bag, to keep them away from taking my change. I've never mentioned to her about my grandpa seeing them and having them in his house. Another comment says, my wife is Filipino. Her dad owns a 25-acre farm at the base of Mount Banahaw, which is considered a holy mountain to the people of the Philippines, especially those that live at the base of the mountain. She swears that when she was a kid and would visit the farm with her dad, and while he was off cutting down coconuts and stuff, she had a friend that could be best described as a gnome or elf. She says her friend was genderless, small, and lived inside a small hill at the back of the property. This friend would bring her gifts and invite her into its little hill home. Only she could see it. Her mother never believed her, nor did anyone else in the family. Her dad entertained her and promised that nothing would happen to the hill, and they left it on the property until that section of the land was sold. She never saw her friend again after that. Okay, I've got one more comment I want to read. Quote, I don't know if this is a duende story since this was in Virginia at the time, but I have something very similar. My friend and I were neighbors, and we were between the ages of 7 and 9. We were playing at my house, and it started to get dark out, and I asked my mom if she could spend the night. My mom said yes, so my friend and I went outside to walk to her house to get her sleepover stuff. Her house was very close to mine and was basically across the street. We're walking with our arms linked, and all of a sudden, we both halt at the exact same time, and I'm watching this thing that's like maybe a foot or so tall, running very fast in front of us across the street. It was almost hunched over, and it looked a little wrinkled from what I could see in the dark, but I very specifically remember it was running on 2 legs. As soon as it ran past us, my friend and I looked at each other and had a silent moment confirming we both saw it, and then we immediately sprinted to her house. The crazy thing is, we told her parents right then and there, which is the only reason I still believe this story. Her parents told us it was a squirrel or something, but I always thought it looked like a miniature version of Dobby from Harry Potter. I totally forget about this story most of the time, but when I do remember, I'm always stumped as to what it was. Alright, I know that was some rapid-fire comment reading, but there were so many great experiences in this thread. It's so fun to hear these stories from so many different places and cultures. So I think what we'll do now is read a couple of stories from the fairy census. Now, if you want to read the fairy census, or you would like to submit to the fairy census, if you have a first-hand experience with a fairy, seeing a fairy, or whatever you consider to be your own fairy experience, it is ongoing, so you can submit to it. I will have links in the description of wherever you're listening to. Either read it or download it or submit to it. So, this story is going to be from the second fairy census, and it took place in Kent, England, sometime between the year 2010 and 2020. The witness was in their 40s, and the time was between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. Several weekends ago, I went into my garden to give it the last mow of the year. My 8-year-old son was in the garden with me, whilst my wife and daughter were in our allotment, picking pumpkins and squash. I turned because my son was asking about the bee's nest in our summer house, when I was suddenly surrounded by flying bodies, at first with bees uppermost in my mind. I was about to duck and run when I realized what was happening. I called to my son, and the two of us stood transfixed as tiny, and I mean proper tiny, winged people flew about us, catching the late autumn sun. My son eventually asked, "Are they fairies, Daddy?" I said, "I'm guessing so, son, but different from the ones of my youth. I saw many small folk as a child, and went actively looking in my teens. My 12-year-old daughter and wife entered the garden with a wheelbarrow full of vegetables. My son called to his sister to come see, and she ran down, but the small host was definitely thinning. She, however, squealed at what she saw and called to my wife. My son said, "They're gone now," and went indoors, as my wife walked down to stand beside us. I could see in her face she believed it to be a game, but as she stood with a happy smile on her face, she clearly saw one. I saw her expression change, and she gasped, "Oh my God, what was that?" It looked like She never said the word, but I could see it in her eyes. My daughter danced happily in the garden for a bit, singing, "We've got fairies," whilst my wife just looked at me stunned and asked again what it was. I smiled and said, "It's exactly what you want it to be." She went off smiling, followed by my daughter, and I finished mowing the lawn, alone in the garden. The fairies had tiny, very thin bodies, delicate legs and arms, and were very pale, possibly translucent. They had 2 dark eyes on a round head. It's very rare for there to be multiple people who witness the same thing at the same time. Only 6% of the reports in the fairy census are cases where multiple people experience the same thing together. Usually people are alone when they have these kinds of experiences. But here we have a whole family. It sounds like a very magical experience. What's interesting is that in folklore, fairies are not described as having wings or really matching the description of what the accepted commercial media portrayal of what a fairy is nowadays. Little cutesy winged beings. This is definitely the case in Irish folklore, but it seems to also be so in most of the cultures we touched on tonight. There wasn't any mention of wings in Malay, Native American, Filipino, or Mexican folklore and experiences. The only time it came up was in modern-day England just now and America. There was that comment I read earlier that was from California where a woman in labor told her attending nurse that she saw little winged fairies in her garden. But people are having experiences seeing tiny winged fairies. There's quite a few of them in the fairy census, so I'm definitely not denying that. But are they seeing the true form of these beings? Or do these beings, whatever they are, have the ability to reflect the physical form of whatever cultural context the experiencer might subconsciously expect or project onto them? This type of theory could propose that all the different paranormal phenomena encountered by humans, fairies, ghosts, Bigfoot, aliens, whatever it may be, are from the same source, but take on a variety of forms, perhaps to suit the expectations of the witness. This experience I'm going to read from Sweden in the first fairy census seems to agree with that idea. This took place in the 1990s when the witness was between 11 and 20 years old. They said that this took place in a woodland between the time of 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. They don't explain what happened. They just give a description of the entity they saw. Quote, "It was pale, green-faced, hooded in black. It had a flat nose and narrow eyes. A mischievous, dwarfish thing. I think that fairies and aliens are the same beings. Fairies are archetypal beings that live inside our mindscape, and somehow, sometimes, they can manifest in the physical world." Very interesting to me that they said that they think that fairies and aliens are the same beings, because so much overlap. I say this again and again, but there's just so much overlap between fairy experiences and alien abductions or UFO experiences. And just to reinforce that, this witness also reported that they experienced a loss of sense of time, profound silence before the experience, hair prickling or tingling before or during the experience, and unusually clouded memories of the experience. these are all things that also appear in UFO experiences. This archetypal projection theory is an interesting one. However, there are some experiences that are so strange you couldn't possibly expect to see what you see. Let's take a look at an example of such a case. This is from the first fairy census and took place in the Isle of Man in the 1970s. The witness was in their 30s and the time was between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. I was working on a missing air case, looking for a family on the Isle of Man. I was in a taxi, driving from a farm back to my hotel in Castletown. The driver told me the story of the ferry bridge and gave the greeting as we crossed it. A few minutes later, I saw in the headlights and several feet ahead of the car 3 strange forms going across the road. They were not humanoid in shape, but looked as though they were flat rather than 3D and had a jagged outline about 8 inches or so high. Strangely, they appeared in the headlights to be bright pink. The driver saw this too, but couldn't explain it. They were 6 to 8 inches tall and maybe 5 inches broad, but like a flat sheet of fluorescent pink card with jagged edges. However, they moved in a procession of 3 from the left to the right of the country road. The comments made earlier by the driver suggested fairies, but it could have been something else. This memory has lasted clearly for many years. By nature, I am skeptical, and I've always tried to examine things with a view to finding an explanation. I've never been able to find one for this. I love that story. It definitely, to me, falls under a high strangeness category. That's a very interesting one. And there are a lot of highly strange reports in the fairy census, things that you read and you're like, what made you think at all that this was a fairy and submit this to the fairy census? Now, that being said, I'm very glad they did because I love high strangeness accounts, probably most of all. Just super, super interesting. Also, really quickly, I just have to touch on the ferry bridge in the story they mentioned. Going across the bridge and the taxi driver gave the greeting. What this is referring to is the ferry bridge in the Isle of Man. That's what it's called. It's got its own little sign and everything. And there's a tradition or a superstition that when you are about to cross or drive over the ferry bridge, you have to greet the fairies before you do so. I think you can wave, or maybe you actually have to say something out loud, say hello to the fairies. Not only is it polite, but the idea is if you don't, then there could be consequences, such as a punctured tire or something like that. Here is what a travel website for the Isle of Man says. Don't forget to say hello to the little people as you drive over Ferry Bridge on the A5 Douglas to Balasala Road. Ask any local on the Isle of Man and they'll tell you that they greet the fairies as they pass over the bridge because it's considered bad luck if you don't, especially if you're heading to the airport. Some visitors write little notes and tie them on the trees next to the bridge in the hope for a little fairy magic. There are tales abound of people's misfortune who failed to greet the fairies, including chicken pox, lost passports, flight cancellations, cars breaking down, and more. Taxi, bus, and coach drivers will usually tell visitors to say hello, and if you're on board a bus, then you will hear the murmur of passengers saying hello as they pass. That's adorable. I love that. I'm also going to play a little snippet of audio from a BBC broadcast about the ferry bridge. It's from 1970, I believe, and the interviewer is riding in a car with a local, and he's telling him about this tradition.
You've got to say hello to the little people when you come over the bridge.
We gotta do what?
Say hello to the little people.
Go on.
You do. It's just round this corner. All right?
What little people?
Fairies.
You mean fairies?
The fairies, they live under this bridge.
They live under this bridge?
This is the fairy bridge, you see.
Never
Say
on your
hello,
life.
little people.
Well, what happens if we don't wave to them?
Oh, you have a puncture or something like that.
Go on.
You do.
But do you actually believe in fairies?
Me? Well, no, I don't, but a few months ago, when my wife and I came down here, I didn't say hello to the little people. Well, the following day, we were out for a walk and I slipped down a hole that I didn't see, and the result was I had my leg in plaster for 5 weeks.
You think the fairies were responsible?
It might have been that, or it might have been the fact that it was Friday the 13th.
I think it's so fascinating that this man, this local, acknowledges that you have to say hello to the fairies when you drive over the bridge, and even acknowledges that the fairies might have caused him to twist his ankle for not saying hello one time. But he doesn't believe in fairies, of course. Either way, I'm glad that the tradition still exists. All right, so I think that is going to be all for tonight. I really, really hope that you enjoyed all the experiences and all the folklore and visiting all these different versions of fairy and various cultures. I was particularly fascinated by the Orang Bunyan, and I'm going to continue to look into that subject because it really, really interests me. Particularly the plate borrowing. I just think that those stories are so cool and seemingly pretty unique to me, but definitely clue me in if you've heard something similar. Also, I just want to say that as I was in the process of recording this, one of my favorite podcasts, Strange Familiars, which I'm sure some of you are already familiar with, just released a new episode, and it's from a visit that Tim Renner, the host, did to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Seems he got this amazing opportunity to visit and stay on the reservation for a week and interview the locals there about supernatural beings, mainly Bigfoot, but there's also a number of little people stories and also giant owls with the voice of an old woman. Pretty amazing stuff, and it's all recordings of these people telling their own stories. It is absolutely amazing, so I highly recommend listening to that if you haven't already, or if you're not familiar. I don't know if it's going to be the most recent episode or not by the time you listen to this, so I'll just say that it's called Pine Ridge Bigfoot, but it's episode 500, so that'll be easy to find if you do want to go back and listen to that, which I recommend. Because it's not very often that you get to hear Native American people telling these kinds of stories straight from their mouth. You know, I had to find Reddit pages and books and essays, most of which were not actually written by Native American people. So, really, really awesome stuff. Anyways, I'll be back soon with more stories, more experiences, more folklore. Thank you so, so much for joining me tonight and spending some time with one foot in each realm. Until next time, take care and good night.